Hello, and thanks for joining us for episode 7 of Paranormal United States, Weird Connecticut.
Yeah, so for this episode, we are going to look at the Norwich State Hospital, which is in Preston, Connecticut. And this started life as the actually called the Norwich State Hospital for the Criminally Insane when it opened in 1903, but it later changed its actual name to just the Norwich State Hospital. This was open until 1996, so it was open for nearly 100 years. It started out as just a single building with a handful of residents, while gradually growing bigger and bigger, with more buildings being added until at its peak, it was a self-sustaining village. It grew its own food, had its own buildings, it had a bowling alley, a theatre, a host of other premises to improve the life of some of those that actually lived in the building and the other buildings that popped up. So what they did was, as more residents came, they just kept building more buildings. More residents came, just kept building more buildings. At its peak, it had grown to over 3,000 residents, which is quite a lot of
Yeah,
what they would call insane people living there. And obviously, all the staff, most of the staff lived on the premises as well. So you had the staff quarters, the staff buildings, obviously all the doctors' rooms and everything else. So it was a massive, massive complex, over 40 buildings. I think it was like 900 acres or something. And on the video version here, you can see it's like a layout of the actual plans.
wow. That's like a small village.
Yeah, it was pretty much was a village. It was massive, and it held mostly psychiatric patients. Some of the worst type of people were staying there. Like obviously murderers and serial killers and those people that done some nasty, nasty stuff, like you would expect in this type of place. But you also had later on, you had TB patients there, tuberculosis for a while in the 1930s. You had people that were chemically addicted, so people addicted to drugs and other addictions staying there as well, and even some just older people
Oh,
who just stuck there as well. So
wow.
they had a wide range of stuff going on there. But like as with many of these hospitals of this type, especially back in the turn of the 20th century, not much was known about like these mental health conditions and these disorders. So the treatment wasn't very nice, to put it um, nicely, I guess, because they didn't know how to treat them and didn't have like the drugs that they have available today to help deal with like psychosis and things like this. And so they would use treatments like being mechanically restrained, electric shock treatment, lobotomies.
Wow.
And as you'd expect, there's a lot of deaths from these medical treatments and deaths in general as well, just from accidents. Because there's 3,000 people just in residence living there.
Mm-hmm.
There's all sorts of things going on. Quite a lot of people did die. And the patients were also systematically subjected to all sorts of abuse, from physical and sexual abuse to being starved, confined in spaces, left on their own for days, packed in ice. They're basically tortured.
Wow.
I think a lot of the time, a lot of these places, that sort of stuff went on, and there's not really much records to show who was there or
Mm-hmm.
sort of how they were treated. It's just messed up, really. One of the lesser known things, it also took part in eugenics,
Okay.
which is controlled human procreating. So they would forcibly sterilize those that they judged to be mentally or psychologically ill so that they couldn't reproduce and make more ill people.
Mm-hmm.
And in total, nearly 600 people were sterilized at the hospital,
Wow.
which is I think it's the second largest figure for a single hospital to have sterilized that many people. And most of them was against their will as well.
I can imagine so.
So they used to do like vasectomies and all sorts just to stop them being able to reproduce.
Wow.
When it came to the closure, it happened pretty quickly. They'd been moving residents out for a while, but when the closure came, it's basically like everyone just upped and left. They came and just said, right, you're closed, just go. Equipment was left, medical equipment was left, drugs were left, some pretty strong drugs were just left, medical records are left, everything was just left. even some of the patients, allegedly.
Okay.
So that hasn't been farmed out to other hospitals. It was literally that quick, they just left. And like when people had broken into sort of the property in the years after it had been closed, in the first couple of years, some of the old patients were still there. So obviously they'd been institutionalized, and even the ones that had been took to other places or just let out back into society without any sort of de-institutionalization, didn't know how to live, had no money, nowhere to go, didn't know any other way of life. So they made their way back to the hospital,
Oh, wow.
broke in, and just started squatting there because it was all they knew. So people would go in and then find just these people still walking around the premises. Like I say, it's a big, massive, massive area, and these are like not well people mentally. So it's quite scary for people going in and still finding these people
Very much so.
walking around. So in terms of sort of the paranormal side of things,
Hmm.
obviously, old building, lots of negative energy there, lots of deaths. And the reports mainly from staff after it closed, so security guards, groundsmen that's still on the property, and even the nurses when it was open would report hearing just disembodied screams, the sound of children, particularly on the second floor of the research office, the research building. They would hear kids, so they'd go and check it out, thinking shouldn't be kids in this building, but there'd be no one there because there were actual kids kept there. And
Okay.
there's pictures from like the 1950s where there's adults and child boys being kept there as well, being kept together by the looks of it. So kids have been heard in the research lab and in the tunnel. So obviously there's lots and lots of buildings on the property. So they built tunnels so they could easily get like a group of patients to another area quite quickly, and also move equipment and stuff that way as well. So in the tunnels, there's been quite a lot of things being seen, shadows being seen, screams being heard, and basically like sounds of anguish being heard. And that's quite a creepy,
Yeah.
quite a creepy place. There's the morgue, as you expect. There's quite a place where things have been heard, and just a general feeling that there's something in there with me, which you might expect from that sort of location where the bodies were being kept.
Yeah. It doesn't sound like the best place to be.
No, like I say, like you're watching the video version, you see behind me, the rooms was left.
Yeah.
So so it's never been. So for all the years it was after it closed, and never let anybody go and do actual official investigations there. The only one time that they allowed it was when they let ghost hunters in,
Okay.
the TAPS team.
Yep.
So they're the only official investigation I've ever been into the property.
Wow.
And they went to a number of buildings, doing investigations and into the tunnels.
Did they get anything? Yeah.
They did. Obviously, it's a TV show. It's believe what you want to believe, but it was actually quite good. Some of the results they got. One part where there's two women going on. They're like split into like three groups of two. And there's two women together, and they're like in the tunnels, and they come out into a random building that they didn't know what building it was in, but it's just sort of like lots of rooms, hospital doors, and beds in. And as they're talking, they're facing like sort of towards the camera, and they both hear noise behind them. So they both turn as they hear a noise, and obviously there's no one there. But when you watch the video back, they're facing the camera, but there's doors behind them, and you see one of the doors closed. And as they turn around, the door's still closed, and they don't notice that it's the door's closed. And they turn around because they hear a noise. But on the video, the door's closing at the same time as they're hearing this noise.
Oh,
And in the things in the research lab, on one of the floors near the stairways, the first sort of team went up there, and they both saw what looked like a light and sort of heard like footsteps near the stairwell, and they both saw like a black mass about 3 foot high sort of move across from left to right
wow.
down the corridor. And then they obviously didn't speak to the other teams until afterwards, but when the next team went into the same building, they saw the same thing.
Oh,
And they
wow.
both saw what looked like a small adult sized black mass or shadow just move across. And at one point, it looked like it was like sort of peeking around the corner looking at him. And then obviously they went there, and there's nothing there. There's no way it could have been anybody just that else has sneaked in, because they were on the stairwell and they would have heard like someone else on the stairwell.
Yeah.
So it's quite weird that they both teams separate to each other saw the same thing in the same space.
That's insane.
Uh,
Literally
so
insane.
yeah, so that's like I say, decent bit of evidence for the you got the door moving on
Hmm.
the camera. You can
Yeah.
hear some of the sounds in one of the clips. I think it's when they're in the morgue, which was I think the morgue was in the research lab. I might be wrong on that, but they hear what sounds like a dog whimpering, like it had been kicked. Is
Oh
how they
wow.
described it as, and you can hear. Maybe it's because it's put in your head, but you can hear that sort of noise on the
Hmm.
audio. But they apparently did do animal experiments in the research building as well.
Oh wow.
So again, it just ties in that
Yeah.
it could have been something there.
That's that's really odd, especially to capture those bits. That's pretty crazy, I think. But
Yeah, and they're the only team that I've been in officially. Not like obviously quite a few people broken in and
yeah,
been around at night and kids and stuff, but
no thanks.
officially they're
But
the only investigation team.
wow.
But pretty creepy. And now,
Yeah.
and since then, that was in 2010 when Ghost Hunters went there. And I think since then, most of the buildings have been destroyed. It's all dilapidated. When you're watching the TV episode of Ghost Hunters, it all looks like it's about to fall down any minute. So the noises they heard could be just a building or
Yeah.
rats or something, or it could be people in there
Yeah.
that are still squatting or homeless people or whoever. But it's very creepy. But now, like I say, most of it's been demolished and there's only like two or three buildings left standing as they're trying to sell it off and find
Yeah.
someone to take over the land.
So, is there anything in the local area? So, the local um, village or towns or anything that's close by?
Well, the town of Norwich is just across the river. It's right on the banks of the River Thames in Connecticut. So it's sort of like between Preston and Norwich. But the actual area is nothing too close to it. It's a bit out. It's on a big, massive piece of land that's quite empty.
Yeah, because I just wondered, because then you could explain some of it by people sort of just rocking up. But if it's a fair distance, then I suppose less chance of people being just randomly there.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of security on there as well. So I think there's a lot of toxic waste, medical waste still there. And obviously, buildings from back in the day probably filled with asbestos and lead.
Yeah,
I think that's the reason why they don't let people investigate officially in there. It just probably just would have been a danger, really. Probably why they found difficulty getting buyers for it as well, because it probably cost a lot just to clear it of everything
yeah.
that was there. That's the Norwich State Hospital.
And thanks for joining us for Paranormal United States, Episode 7. We're Connecticut.